Everybody. Welcome to this lecture about Nazi laws in Germany during and just before World War II. I'm Kathy Lesser-Mansfield. I'm a professor at Case University Law School, and I wish we were doing this in person, but we'll do the best we can in this format. I know Eric is going to have the activity number posted in the chat for those of you that are getting CLE. Okay, so let's get started. I can get my computer to advance. Okay, so I'm basically going to start with a bit of a political history of Germany through World War I, and then from there discuss the way the government moved from being a democracy to being a dictatorship under Hitler's leadership, and then a little bit about the anti-Jewish legislation that was adopted in Nazi Germany, and then a little bit about the court system in Nazi Germany and the role that lawyers and judges played in perpetrating the Holocaust. So just a brief history. Germany had been a conglomeration of small states. It had been run under three Kaisers, and the one that I'm going to talk about is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was Kaiser during World War I. He abdicated at the end of World War I and was exiled to the Netherlands, leaving somewhat of a political vacuum in Germany. It's important to just know a couple things about World War I. One thing is that it was carried out under Kaiser Wilhelm II, and it was mostly fought off German soil. So most German citizens thought the war was going quite well, and so they were kind of shocked when the war ended and when Germany lost the war. And that led for a search as to why Germany had lost the war. And that led to this stabbed in the back myth, which is that Germany actually wouldn't have lost the war but for the fact that it had been stabbed in the back by socialists, liberals, Marxists, and Jews on the home front. So there's the sense that there's this like communist Jewish revolt going on in Germany. And then there's also this sort of shock as the soldiers were coming home from World War I to find that things were so dire on the home front. There was rampant starvation and disease, and this was shocking to the returning troops. So World War I, the Kaiser abdicated on November 9th, which is a sort of banner day for Nazi Germany and for Germany in general. Later on, it becomes the day that Hitler tried to take over the government, and it also is the day that the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, so it's a big day in Germany. On November 9th of 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated, and at the time the majority political party was the Social Democratic Party. They announced the establishment of a republic with Friedrich Ebert as chancellor, and he was going to head this provisional government. This comes up later because the fact that it was just sort of announced became sort of a bone of contention with the more conservative members of the judiciary and others in Germany, because they felt that the government as established this way was not really a legitimate government. Politics became very polarized. On the left, you had the communists, and on the right, you had the Freikorps and some other groups, including eventually the Nazis. November 11th, of course, was the armistice ending World War I. That's why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. And then on January 1919, just a couple months later, the German voters elected a national assembly, and their job was to draft a constitution. At the same time, you started having these rebellions or attempts to take over the government by both the left and the right. So there was one in January of 1919 in Berlin. Then in April of 1919, there was a left-wing attempt to take over Munich. They declared Munich as the Munich Soviet Republic. The government sent in troops to put down the rebellion, and they also used mercenary soldiers called the Freikorps. Over 500 people were killed. There was out and out fighting using weapons in the streets in Munich. Then in June of 1919, the Versailles Treaty was signed, which was the treaty that at the end of World War I set forth the reparations and everything. By August, a constitution had been drafted and was signed into law. And I'm going to hopefully show you this very brief video about the Weimar Constitution. If you're not seeing this, please let me know. Unfortunately, I have to skip an ad here.
Package for James Miser.
Okay, I'm getting
Once you start smoking, the consequences will find you. Cigarettes may leave you with stained teeth,
Sorry,
gum
give me
disease,
just a second
and
to
more.
get through this commercial. It's worth it. Oh, are we still going? Oh, no.
February 1919. In Weimar, once home to Goethe and Schiller, the fall of the emperor paves the way for a freely elected National Assembly of the First German Republic. Democracy is completely new for many citizens.
I can remember my relatives speaking of a woman, a teacher's widow, who had volunteered to put up 3 delegates. Can this lady take such people into her home?
The delegates come to Weimar because there's unrest in Berlin. In 1918, the Great War had been lost. The emperor had been overthrown, and now the communists are hustling for power. In January 19, there's an uprising. It is crushed brutally. For the first time, women are allowed to both stand and vote in this election for the National Assembly. Parties pushing for a parliamentary republic receive a 2/3 majority. The SPD becomes the strongest party. Its leader, Friedrich Ebert, becomes the first president of the Weimar Republic.
Das Wesen unserer Verfassung soll vor allem Freiheit sein. Freiheit für alle Volksgenossen. Aber jede Freiheit, an der mehrere teilnehmen, muss ihren Faktum haben.
After many months of deliberation, the delegates enact the so-called Weimar Constitution. Germany becomes a democratic republic. The government is no longer responsible to the emperor, but to parliament. For the first time in German history, government authority emanates from the people. The Constitution follows on from the failed revolution of 1848 and the ideals of the Paulskirche Assembly. Black, red, and gold, representing the German liberal tradition, are the chosen colors of the Weimar Republic. But the new state must bear the consequences of the war. The Treaty of Versailles allows victors to dictate their terms. Germany loses 1/7 of its territory and must pay reparations.
Everyone called it the shameful Treaty of Versailles. Of course, without having read the many hundreds of paragraphs. There was great unanimity against the Versailles Treaty.
Protests are also directed against the Republic. Supposedly, the Democrats and Socialists abandoned the victorious troops, the so-called stab in the back. The lie proves effective. Already in the first elections to the Reichstag in June 1920, the government parties of the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrats, Catholic Center Party, and the left liberals lose their majority. They would never regain this power. From the very beginning, also in Parliament, the young democracy faces determined opposition.
Okay, now I'm just going to go back to sharing the PowerPoint. There we go. Sorry, give me just 1 second. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry, just having some technical issues here. Could someone tell me if you can see the PowerPoint again? Just email, put something in the chat. Okay, great, got it. Thank you all so much. This is just a test to see if you're all paying attention. Okay, so the Weimar Constitution gets adopted on August 11th, and I just think it's worth going through some of the provisions because it's so very similar to most constitutions. So it establishes 3 positions or executive positions. One is it establishes a presidency. The president is elected by popular election for 7 years. There's a provision for re-election and recall by popular vote. Of course, Friedrich Ebert is the first president. It establishes the chancellor position. That person is appointed by the president, and that is eventually the position that Hitler will first take. That person presides over the government of the Reich and conducts its affairs, and also determines the political program, and then also recommends ministers, cabinet ministers to the president. On the legislative side, sorry, I'm having all kinds of technical issues here. Okay, on the legislative side, you get 2 houses of parliament. One is the sort of popularly elected chamber, kind of like our House of Representatives. That's the Reichstag. It's elected by universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage by men and women over 20 years of age. It's one of the earliest provisions giving women the right to vote. The seats are allotted to political parties based on the percent of votes they receive. The term of office is 4 years, and they can pass laws by simple majority. And again, none of this is as striking as the fact that these rules existed, considering what's coming up. The other chamber was called the Reichsrat. That was elected by the parliaments of the 18 German states, so sort of similar to our Senate. 1 representative for each state, but larger states got a bigger representation. And then there was a provision for how legislation was supposed to be adopted and passed. It was supposed to be introduced by the cabinet. Then it was enacted by the Reichstag, which is the popularly elected body. Once it was adopted, it could be protested by the Reichsrat, and then it had to go back to the Reichstag. They could override the protest by 2/3 vote. The president could call for a popular referendum on a law passed by the Reichstag within 1 month after its passage, so they could put it to the people, to the populace for a vote. And so there were all these ways of getting legislation through that had checks and balances of a different sort than ours, but of the same general flavor. Then they had this provision, they had 2 provisions which become really important for the Nazi takeover later. So one is that the Constitution could only be amended if 2/3 of the members of the legislature were present and 2/3 of those consented. And that becomes important later because the way they changed the Constitution to allow for Hitler's rise to power was by arresting some of the members of the legislature, but keeping that majority intact. Then they had this provision, which I think the only thing comparable in our law is the right for the president to declare martial law. But this one was used much more frequently and was much more liberal. So Article 48 basically said that the president could use the aid of armed forces if any state didn't do what they were supposed to do. And in the key part, in the event that the public order and security are seriously disturbed or endangered, the president may take the measures necessary for their restoration, intervening if necessary with the aid of the armed forces, For this purpose, he may temporarily abrogate wholly or in part. And then it goes on to list what is basically our Bill of Rights. Germany had in the Weimar Constitution the right to personal liberty, that every German's house is a sanctuary, secrecy of communication, freedom of expression, right to assembly, right of non-criminal association, and right to private property. So all of those could be abrogated under this Article 48. And then this had a check and balance too, which is that the Reichstag could vote to annul the measures taken. And then the last provision that's important to later events is that the president could dissolve the Reichstag and hold new elections. So even though the Reichstag's term was for 4 years, what we find leading up to and immediately after Hitler's rise to power is these frequent elections being called over and over and over again. I remember when I first started studying this stuff, I couldn't understand how it was possible to have so many elections in such a short time, sometimes months apart. So Article 48, the one that allows the president to get rid of the constitutional rights, it was used a lot in the infant years of the Weimar Republic, 136 times by Ebert, and sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for purely political ones. But the key was that he generally returned power to the legislature right away. Okay, so that's the governmental structure under the Constitution. You still get through the 20s these right and left wing attempts to take over the government. One of them is the Cap Putsch, which is a famous one, which was a conservative attempt to overthrow the government in Berlin. Then in 1920, you get your first representatives to the Reichstag. In 21, the reparations for World War I are sent. Germany falls behind. France and Belgium send troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley in Germany. And then at the urging of the government, workers went on strike to protest that, and then Germany supported them by printing money, which led to this picture that I'm sure some of you may remember from elementary school or junior high school. There's this one, the other famous one is a wheelbarrow full of money. There was such inflation that the value of their currency changed dramatically in an hour or in a given day. And by November 1923, there was 4.2 trillion marks to a single dollar. As I said, Frederick Ebert used Article 48. Then eventually in 23, we get what's called the Beer Hall Putsch, which some of you may have heard of. This is when Hitler attempted to take over the government. I'm going to show you a short video clip about that.
In Munich in 1923, in the atmosphere of crisis caused by the occupation of the Ruhr, Hitler and the Nazis acted. Hitler stood on the stage of the Bürgerbräuhalle on November the 8th and interrupted a right-wing political meeting. He called for a national revolution to start in Bavaria and overthrow the left-wing government in Berlin. The next day, the Nazis, together with other right-wing parties, marched through Munich to gain support. They were stopped by the police at the War Memorial at the Feldherrnhalle. The Nazis hoped the army and police, many of whom supported right-wing parties, would join them in a march on Berlin.
Wir haben geglänzt als Marschierer und kommen dann in die Maximilianstraße, die überkreuzen wir. Und wie ich dann an die Ecke der Residenz komme, hören wir die Schüsse fallen.
The police didn't support them. Shots were fired, and the marchers were routed. Hitler fled from the scene. 4 policemen and 16 Nazis lost their lives.
Sie haben mich schon einmal gefragt, was ich da für Emotionen gehabt habe. Da möchte ich sagen, ja, da habe ich eigentlich die ersten politischen Emotionen gehabt, wie etwas eben, wie etwas schief gehen kann. Es war schon an sich ein Schlag für mich und für viele meiner Kameraden, dass das passieren konnte.
Just wanted to say, I see we're getting a couple questions and I'm happy to answer them, but I'm going to try and get through the presentation first and then take questions. So feel free to raise your hand or write down your question, and then I'll come back to them at the end. In the 20s, Hitler is, because of the beer hall putsch, he's arrested for treason. He's tried, is given a pretty light sentence, and he writes Mein Kampf while he's in jail, which of course is his manifesto on what he intends to do with the Jews and otherwise once he takes over the government. So through the 20s, you get basically the economy gets better, then it gets worse. President Paul von Hindenburg was elected as president. He's an older gentleman. He's a conservative. He thinks the democracy is somewhat illegitimate. He uses Article 48 many, many times, calls elections many times. And then in the early 30s, the Nazis start gaining seats in the Reichstag, eventually becoming the majority party in July of 32. And then this is the day when things really start, and that is January 30th, 1933. So President Hindenburg was still the president. Under the Constitution, he gets the right to appoint the chancellor. And for many reasons, many books have been written, about which many books have been written, he appoints Hitler as chancellor. That allows them to form a nationalist conservative coalition government. It keeps the leftist parties from taking over the government. And there was some element of, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. They also allow Hitler to designate 2 cabinet ministers. So that gives Hitler a foot in the door, if you will, to the government. This is a video of the celebration march by the Nazi Party in Berlin the night that Hitler was appointed chancellor. And that is the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Okay, so you get the gist there. So that's January 30th of 33, and then the next day, Hitler requests that Hindenburg agree to hold new elections for March 5th in light of the Nazis' rise to the chancellorship. On February 4th, in anticipation of that election, Hindenburg issues a decree called the Decree for the Protection of the German People. It bans political meetings and marches, restricts the press, gives police expanded powers of arrest. These are all things targeted at communists. So that was the first sort of target of this government, was to keep the Communist Party from rising. Something noteworthy here, which we will see over and over again, is the title, the title of the decree, which is the Decree for the Protection of the German People. And I just want to point that out because as I go through the titles of these decrees, you'll notice that there's this sort of, it's us against them, and if we aren't protected, they're going to come after us. And all of the decrees have this kind of language as their title. Okay, the next big thing that happens is the Reichstag fire. So the Reichstag is the building in Berlin where the legislatures meet. And on February 27th, 1933, less than a month after Hitler became chancellor, the building was set on fire. In terms of who set this fire, there's tons of historical research. And even in my short time as a Holocaust scholar of like 20 years or whatever, it has gone back and forth from saying it probably was communist to it was the Nazi Party or the government, which was doing it as a pretext for what came next. I'm not sure we'll ever know. The thinking right now, I believe the last thing I read was that it was likely the Communist Party, but we really don't know. Here's a short video about the fire.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire. The main hall in which the deputies conducted their debates has suffered most from the conflagration. And after the general election, which is about to take place, Parliament will have to find a temporary home elsewhere. Flames are no respecters of persons, and President Hindenburg's own chair was also destroyed. Hitler, now Chancellor, has announced that the fire was the work of communists and was intended to be the signal for a Bolshevist uprising throughout the country. In consequence, Germany has been placed under a system of martial law, a decree having been signed which aims at the total destruction of communism. Here you see them.
So the next day, the day after the fire, a decree was issued called the Reichstag Fire Decree. It was issued under that Article 48, Paragraph 2, the one that I showed you earlier that allowed the government to take away constitutional rights using the army if necessary. It takes away the right to assembly, free speech, and free press. It removes restraints on police investigations. The Gestapo was allowed to take people into what they called protective custody, and the criminal police, or the Kripo, were allowed to take people into what was called preventive detention. In both cases, those were arrests that were based on the likelihood that someone was about to commit a crime, as opposed to the fact that they had committed a crime. It also gave the government authority to overrule state and local laws, and it made punishment more severe, including the death penalty, which replaced previous sentences that had been for life, and it did it retroactively. And so, in other words, so it could apply to anyone who was caught and tried and convicted of lighting the Reichstag fire. And again, it was framed as a defensive measure against communists and acts of violence. They went ahead with the election 6 days later on March 5th. Nazis got 44% of the vote, but combined with the nationalists, 51.9% of the vote, so that gave them a coalition government. And then March 24th, so now less than a month after the fire and less than 2 months after Hitler was appointed chancellor, this piece of legislation was enacted. It was called the Enabling Act. The full name was the Law to Remedy the Distress of the People and the Reich. Again, that protective stance. And it basically legalistically had the Reichstag turn their legislative power over to the position of the chancellor and to his cabinet. So this is like so remarkably important because the Reichstag just ceded their constitutional authority. There was no military coup or destruction of the ability of the Reichstag to meet. It was the Reichstag voting to transfer their power to Hitler as in his position as chancellor. It also provided that laws in the Constitution could be changed without permission by the Reichstag or by the president, who at the time was Hindenburg. Laws could deviate from the Constitution. All laws were effective the day after they were passed. And the way they got it passed through the Reichstag, which actually voted to cede their power, was they detained all 81 of the communists and 26 of 120 social democrats in preventive detention and prevented them from taking their seats and voting. So they came inside the constitutional number of people that had to be in the room in order for there to be a vote, and the number of votes that had to be in existence for the Reichstag to adopt this piece of legislation. And they did it by using the prior decree allowing for preventive detention. So, and I just want to point out what that leaves then is Hitler as chancellor with the rights of the legislature, and Hindenburg still in the presidency. The next thing they did was they adopted this law that I'm sorry, this was the law that applied the punishment retroactively for the fire. This communist named Lex van der Lubbe was arrested. He was sentenced to hang for creating the fire at the Reichstag. But this is kind of important. There were other defendants who were members of the Communist Party who were not found guilty, and were not, the death sentence was not applied retroactively to them. This really pissed Hitler off. It made him feel that the judges were going too lightly on communists, and it led later to the creation of the People's Court, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. By the way, van der Lubbe was exonerated in 2008, and I'm going to show you just a very brief video about van der Lubbe's trial because I don't want to run out of time. So,
inside the German Supreme Court, 5 men are on trial for a crime that helped sweep Adolf Hitler and his party into power. The first being led in, hands manacled after 8 days before the court, is Baroness van der Lubbe, 24-year-old Hollander who has confessed. The others are German and Bulgarian communists.
Okay, so we're just going to leave that there. The next thing they did, the very first thing after the whole Reichstag stuff, and still within 3 months of the regime being in power, was they started doing anti-Jewish legislation. And so I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about that. The very first one was on April 1st. It was a boycott of Jewish businesses in Germany. And this particular picture, there are lots and lots of pictures of the boycott. I'm going to show you a film in a second. I find this one to be particularly disturbing because this is a cameraman who was set up to take pictures of any non-Jews who were frequenting or going into a Jewish business with the threat of being arrested for violating the boycott. Here's a little bit And again, I'm sorry to stop that midway, but I want to make sure I get through everything. So that was April 1st. April 7th, there was a bunch of anti-Jewish legislation and also anti-communist legislation. The first was called the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Servants. It basically kicked anyone out of the civil service who was a communist or who was of non-Aryan descent. And non-Aryan descent was basically if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were considered non-Aryan. You'll notice in paragraph 2.2 here, there's an exemption for anyone basically who fought on the front in World War I or people who got the Iron Cross. So there were exemptions for people who had defended Germany during World War I. And then there was also a provision for firing anyone in the civil service whose political activity suggested they wouldn't support the Nazi regime. This is a bigger deal in Germany than it would be here because more things were considered civil service there than there are here, like teachers and other professions. And in fact, this is the letter firing a teacher who was Jewish, who had been the principal of a large public high school. She was fired under this law for the restoration of the civil service. There was also a law adopted the same day called the Law Concerning Admission to the Bar. It prohibited admission of attorneys to the bar who were of non-Aryan descent and also to revoke the right to practice of attorneys who were of non-Aryan descent. But it's also important, again, that there's an exemption for anyone who was admitted on August 1st, 1914, who fought in World War I or whose fathers or sons were killed in World War I. And of course, they didn't call it that at that time. But anyway, and then I just want to point out, many of you may know Saul Friedlander's work. He's one of the preeminent scholars about the Holocaust. And his research showed that because of the exemptions, a lot of attorneys and judges were allowed to continue working at least after the adoption of this particular statute. These are actually photos of the attorneys who were admitted to the bar lining up outside the Bar Association in Berlin to prove that they were entitled to one of the exemptions and allowed to continue practicing law or being a judge or whatever. And then I just wanted to show you all this because I think it's kind of cool. There were massive rallies in Cleveland and in other cities against the legislation that was starting to come out of Germany against the Jews. And this is actually public auditorium where there was a huge rally. And then this next one, there was a big parade in Chicago. I've given this speech in Chicago several times, which is why I have footage from Chicago. But for our purposes, we will skip that. Okay, so then the next big thing that happens is Hitler's just waiting for Hindenburg to die. He must have felt that he could not have taken over fully as long as Hindenburg was president. And so on August 1st, he promulgated a law regarding the sovereign head of the German Reich. This is the day before Hindenburg dies. It consolidates the office of the president with the chancellor. So now the legislative power is with the chancellor, and after Hindenburg dies, the presidency, that power is going to be with the chancellor. Hindenburg died the next day, and so Hitler became the only head of the government. And interestingly, on August 19th, that same month, there was a plebiscite, a public vote, approving Hitler as Führer now that he had all this power of the legislature, the presidency, and the chancellery. It passed with a 90% vote. And then just a few days later, the coordination of the bar and bench began. The oath of loyalty changed. The oath of loyalty had previously been for judges and for lawyers. I swear loyalty to the Constitution, obedience to the law, and conscientious fulfillment of the duties of my office, so help me God. On August 20th, after Hindenburg died and Hitler became Führer, the oath was, I swear I'll be true and obedient to the Führer of the German Reich and people. Adolf Hitler observed the law and conscientiously fulfilled the duties of my office, so help me God. And this is actually a picture of judges taking the oath of office with this oath to Hitler. Okay, next big laws, and I'm going to buzz through these, are the two Nuremberg laws. One decided who was a citizen of Germany. The second basically prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Germans and Jews. They're called the Nuremberg laws because they were issued in Nuremberg. I'm going to skip this video, which is the announcement of the laws. So the reason I have this in here, and I'm not going to actually get to delve into this quite as much, is that the law actually prohibited marriage between Jews and Germans and sexual intercourse between Jews and Germans. But those two terms are not defined in the law. This then leads to a Supreme Court decision, which reads a lot like our Supreme Court decisions. You get this prohibition on sex between Jews and non-Jews. You get no definition of a Jew. Later on, they define who a Jew is, but they don't define extramarital relations until Article 11, in which they say it only refers to sexual relations, but they don't define what sexual relations is. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. There was tons of other anti-Jewish legislation. You can see in this picture, there's a bench that says nicht für Juden. There were benches that Jews couldn't sit on. They weren't allowed to walk down certain streets. Eventually, they had to wear a Jewish star. They all had to add the middle name, if you were a woman, Sarah, to your legal name. You can see the passport has a J. They took away jewelry. They took away pets. I could do a whole presentation just on the anti-Jewish legislation. Okay, so briefly, we're going to talk about the courts, then we'll come back to that decision on the Nuremberg laws. This is what the court structure looked like prior to the Nazi regime. Looks a lot like our courts. You have a, a limited jurisdiction court at the bottom, district courts, courts of appeals, and then a Supreme Court. These courts were the ones in existence when there was a challenge to the Nuremberg laws in terms of whether or not they could be interpreted a certain way. The reason we know so much about this case is that this gentleman, Chief Judge Erwin Bumke, ended up being, he and his colleagues, there was a justice trial as part of the Nuremberg trials. This gentleman, Judge Bumke, ended up committing suicide in April of 1945, so he was not one of the ones who was actually standing trial in the jurist trial, but this opinion did come out in that trial. Okay, so basically, and again, I'll give Eric some material that people can look at that is prepared by the Holocaust Museum in DC that has this full opinion in it. But the court basically parses through the same kinds of arguments that you would see in one of our cases. What's the question presented? The question of law, which is to be decided by the Great Senate, whether the term sexual relations in the context of Article 11 of the First Ordinance is to be understood as referring only to intercourse, acts similar to intercourse, or all illicit sexual acts. The holding is the term sexual relationships means blah, 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 and they go on to give it a meaning. Why did they reach this decision? They look at the words chosen by the drafters, which in German words are very precise. They look at the words in question in the context of the whole law and the purpose of the law, which, as they say, was to protect German honor as well as German blood. They look at the intent or purpose of the whole law. So I recommend reading that if you get a chance. It's a shocking read. It always shocks my students when they read that because it is so logical and orderly and lawyerly in its presentation. Okay, so Hitler decided that the courts were not aggressive enough for him, and so he created these other extraordinary courts. The Nuremberg trials said that the most crucial and radical change in the judicial system under the Third Reich was the establishment of various extraordinary courts. These irregular tribunals permeated the entire judicial structure and eventually took over all judicial business, which touched political issues or related to the war. The first one created was the Special Court, which was basically to combat anti-Nazi activities. The other court that I'm not going to talk much about is the hereditary health courts, which dealt with sterilization of people who were considered to be unfit for progeny, such as people who were disabled or mentally retarded. Again, you could do a whole lecture about that. And actually, by the way, there's a very good American experience about eugenics that talks about the whole eugenics movement in the United States and in Germany. The one I'm going to focus on here is the People's Court. The People's Court tried treason cases and was just an incredibly aggressive court. Okay, so the special courts. One of the cases in front of the special courts, I'm not going to have time to talk about it fully, but is the Katzenberger case. This is a picture of Irene Seiler, who was one of the defendants in the Katzenberger case, one of the criminal defendants. She was not Jewish, and her co-defendant was a gentleman who was about 30 years older than her, who was like a father to her. He was the president of the Nuremberg Jewish community. They were accused of having sexual relations with each other, and he was accused of defiling a Jewish woman. She was accused of participating in this and also in perjuring herself at the People's Court trial. Again, if you read the transcript from the trial or you read the decision, it's very much like one of our opinions. Is he Jewish? Is she not Jewish? Et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so the trial only took 1 day. Katzenberg was sentenced to death. Seiler was sentenced to 2 years hard labor. This is a picture of her testifying in the jurist trial in Nuremberg. So she survived, he did not, and she became a witness against the judge in this case. Again, the court findings: is he Jewish? Is she German? Did they have extramarital sexual intercourse? you know, were they friends? So it's just findings of fact like you would get in an opinion. And then the findings of law and the legal analysis is very similar to what you would get in one of our opinions. A legal analysis, I'm just reading the last finding. A legal analysis of the established facts shows that in his polluting activities, the defendant Katzenberger generally exploited the exceptional conditions arising from wartime conditions. That was found to violate another statute called the Folkpest Law, which basically allowed for a heavier sentence if someone committed a crime, like having sex with a Jew, and did it in a way that took advantage of the wartime scenario. And in this case, that was that they took advantage of blackouts to sneak around. By the way, they both denied that they ever had sex with each other. They said they had sort of an uncle-niece kind of relationship because he had been a friend of her father. This is just an interesting piece of this. Der Stürmer was a propaganda rag that was vehemently anti-Jewish. And they had an actual ad about the case when it was over and said, the world Jewry will discover that Germany knows how to defend herself with severe measures against Jewish race defilers. Now it will again write using the old long-tried tactics about the medieval conditions prevailing in Germany. It will again glorify those poor, deplorable, harmless Jews who become the victims of National Socialist legislation. It will give vent to spite and malice towards Germany. The People's Court was the treason court. It's very famous for the place where some very important cases took place, including the trial of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose movement. If you don't know who they are, I highly recommend Googling them. It's the White Rose movement, Sophie and Hans Scholl, S-C-H-O-L-L. There's a really good German movie about their case, which reconstructed the courtroom scenes from the actual trial transcripts. This is a photo of Sophie Scholl and her brother and their friend Christoph Probst, who, all three of whom were sentenced to death and were executed by beheading after an extremely short trial in the People's Court. That court also handled the trial of the people who were accused of trying to assassinate Adolf Hitler, including Stauffenberg and Christoph von Dohnanyi's uncle, you know, the gentleman who was the conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra. His uncle participated in that plot. This is, hang on, I want to tell you what it is before I start it. This is video footage of Roland Freisler, who was the chief judge of the People's Court, in the trial against the people who participated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. So this is the judge talking to the defendant.
Sie sind ja ein Hämmerlump. Hätten Sie unter der Gemeinheit? Ja oder nein? Vergessen Sie darunter? Präsident. Ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort? Nein. Nein, Sie können auch nicht mehr zerbrechen. Denn Sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend. Ja, keine Häufchen. Die haben gemacht, bis man die Dienst verpflichtete. Und wo sind Sie hingegangen? Chemische Erzeugung, hat keine Ahnung von Chemie. Werden lieber eine Knarre in die Hand genommen. Wäre ich auf dumme Gedanken gekommen. Ja, natürlich. Die haben ja bestätigt, dass die Verbraucher sind. Also, und werden Sie hier nicht unverschämt.
And then the last court was the hereditary health courts, which were, you actually had a hearing before you were forcibly sterilized. And the people who were to be sterilized was if, according to experience of medical science, a hereditary impairment of his progeny, either physical or mental, is to be expected in all likelihood. So they had this theory that criminality was actually something that was inherited. And so in order to prevent criminals from moving forward, you would sterilize criminals. And in order to prevent deafness going forward, you would sterilize people who were deaf. They actually even sterilized people who had become deaf as adults, not tied to a disease. So that went on as well. Okay, so I'm happy to take whatever questions you have. The first question I always get is, why were those signs in the boycott on April 1st? Why were they in English as well as German? And the answer is I don't know, but they all were. They all had German on the top and German on the top and English on the bottom. Okay, so I'm gonna take a question from Brian Robinson, who's had his hand up for a while. So Brian, I'm gonna click on allow to talk and hopefully you'll be able to. Go ahead.
I was just curious about whether you would recommend reading Mein Kampf, and if that gave any insight into the mind of Hitler as far as his plans to abrogate the German legal system and constitution.
You know, I have it. I've had it for years. I have spot read it, but I have not been able to bring myself to read the whole thing. But I certainly think that it's extremely important because, as is repeated sometimes in history, he basically wrote down exactly what he was going to do. And the fact that he was vehemently anti-Jewish, believed in the stab in the back theory, that's all in there. So it certainly would be a good thing to read, and it's something I know I should read. I just haven't been able to bring.
I've read a lot about the Holocaust, and that's the one book that I understand the trepidation with reading it. It's but it's extraordinary to think that he laid out his plans before the world, and the world simply didn't listen or didn't pay enough attention to what a danger it was. But,
well, and especially when you think about Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, who took the stance initially that England should negotiate, and they basically granted Germany the Sudetenland, and so the first steps were appeasement. And maybe if one had believed what was written in Mein Kampf, that wouldn't necessarily have happened. So thank you for that question. Elizabeth Swenson, I'm gonna have you talk now. Okay, Elizabeth, I think you can talk. You have to unmute yourself though.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay, your hand was up. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, William Lim.
Yes, hi, Professor. This
Hi.
is all very, very fascinating as a history buff. I know earlier in one of the slides you mentioned that the fellow convicted of the Reichstag fire later was exonerated by the German government in 2008. Could you talk a little bit about whether the post-war German government, either West Germany, East Germany, or unified Germany, did take any steps to sort of legally rehabilitate any or all of the people that had been convicted under the Nuremberg laws or the People's Courts or any of the other judicial regimes under the Nazis, in order to sort of legally rehabilitate their reputations or their estates or
Right.
criminal records?
So a couple of things. One is the Nuremberg trials themselves actually tried very few people. There was the trial of the main criminals, and that was like, I think 26 or 28, I don't remember exactly right now, of the really, really big, people who had been in Hitler's cabinet or, really, really big figures, Goering and really important big figures. Then there were subsequent Nuremberg trials that were themed. So there was one about the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving soldiers. So like in Germany, most Jews were deported to to ghettos, and then eventually were deported to killing centers. It was very organized. There was paperwork for each person. You got a notice of deportation. In Poland and in Eastern Europe and Russia, these Einsatzgruppen just went in and basically shot everybody. And the only records that we have are their reports to their commandants. So there was that trial. There was a jurist trial. There was a trial for industrialists who used slave labor, the Krupp trial. By the way, the Yale University has a really good archive of the Nuremberg trials. So if you ever feel like poking around those, they've got a little bit on each of the trials. But at the end of the day, the Nuremberg trials themselves didn't really try that many people. And so it was left to individual countries to try some people or to rehabilitate some people. And in Germany, and
Actually, I think, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think my question was actually, did the German government, after the war, do anything to rehabilitate the people convicted in the people's courts?
Okay, sorry. And of course, that's
similar.
one I don't know the answer to, but most of the people who were convicted in the People's Court were killed. Whether or not they did anything like expunge the records of like Irene Seiler or something like that, I actually don't know the answer to that. So sorry. It's a good question. It's a very good question. And if anyone on the call does know the answer, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, so next on my list is Lancherie Billingsley.
Yes, Lancherie Billingsley.
Hi.
Hi. So my question is, in order to find this, I had to Google Nazi and case, and it was the first option. So I wonder first, what prompted you to do this presentation? And two, could you go through the parallels that you think are going on currently in our society? Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Really good questions. And I'm just gonna say this is the last question I think I'm gonna take during the official time, but I am happy to stay on as long as anybody would like to answer more questions or discuss more things. I got interested in this whole subject because the music you heard at the beginning is music I wrote. I wrote an opera about the Holocaust, and I did the libretto and I did all the research for it. It was a 30-year project. I had been a composer and a musician before I went to law school and continue to be a composer and musician. And so I started doing research. It takes place in Berlin. I took lots and lots of research trips to all these Holocaust museums and did primary research. And then I went to Berlin 3 times and I met with historians and all this other stuff. And at the end of the day, I was already teaching law school. I decided I really wanted to try and marry up my interests. I usually teach contracts and consumer law. And so this is way left field for me. But I got a fellowship at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It was a 2-week summer fellowship with a class, and it was all on law and the Holocaust. And that was in 2007, and that got me interested. And then I started teaching a class at Drake University, where I spent most of my teaching career till I came to case. And I've just gotten more and more interested in it. And I'm Jewish, so I'm interested in it because of that, but I'm also interested in it in so many other ways. And I just feel like there's so much to know. Like I always get a question like, were people expunged? Or there's so much to know. And so I really enjoy continuing to learn about all these things. In terms of the parallels, so I just want to show you the next couple slides. This every year when I teach this class, even before the current times, I ask my class to figure out why the bench and bar became so complicit in Germany, and then could it happen here? And I always find it very reassuring because we have many, many more protections than Germany did. It was a new democracy. And so like these two slides are just things that my students have come up with over the years. And sorry, I'm trying to get things out of the way so I can see my own slides. So in terms of how judges are selected here, it's spread out across state and federal. It's, you know, lifetime appointments, not, you know, the expectation of judicial temperament. Now, I'm not saying that some of these things haven't been compromised, to my mind anyway, in the last few years. For me, and I'm just going to say this, you know, the thing that disturbed me about the Kavanaugh hearings was the judicial temperament issue. Legal training, you know, there is this thing about going to law school where you learn to feel fealty to the profession and to the rule of law and that sort of thing. The way judges can interpret laws, the constitutional limits like void for vagueness, no ex post facto laws, the many sources of law in our system, the age of our system. So my students always come up with, you know, a lot of things that always make me feel better. But I think it's also important to remember that no democracy, no government is immune from this sort of thing. And, you know, every branch of government has to take its rightful place in order for things to not fall apart. And I think that's what's so important about understanding how the Reichstag ceded their power, because it wasn't like Hitler came in and did a coup. He got the Reichstag, you know, granted he arrested people in the Reichstag, but he got them to basically cede their power to him. And then when Hindenburg died, took that power. So, you know, there are, if each piece of the pie doesn't stand up for their territory and for their role, I think then the whole thing can fall in on itself. And so that's what we have to be looking out for, I think, in my humble opinion.